Hello, welcome to Psychological First Aid for Children. This module has 6 sessions. Session 1, Welcome and Introduction. Session 2, What is PFA for Children? Session 3, Children's Reaction to Crisis. Session 4, Identifying Children who need PFA and PFA Action Principles. Session 5, PFA Techniques, How to Communicate with Children in Distress. And Session 6, the wrap-up. I am Anne-Sophie Dybdal, Senior Child Protection and MHPSS Advisor for Save the Children Denmark. This module contains 3 handouts and 1 animated movie. Session 2. What is PFA for children? Psychological first aid is defined as a description of a humane, supportive response to a fellow human being who is suffering and who may need support. This definition is used in the WHO War Trauma Foundation and World Vision Manual, which is based on the SPHERE standards and the IASC MHPSS guidelines. What does PFA involve? It involves giving practical care and support that does not intrude. In itself, practical care does have a psychological calming effect, and it allows you to be in contact with people and to reassure them. It is also about assessing needs and concerns. These include psychological and social needs and concerns. It is helping people access basic needs, for example, food and water, which in itself can have a calming and comforting effect. It is comforting people and helping them to feel calm. For this, we use specific techniques for children. It is also helping people connect to information services and social supports, and it is protecting people from further harm. What is psychological first aid not? It is not something that only professionals can give, and it is not professional counseling. Everybody is able to provide psychological first aid. It is something which is naturally in human beings. We just sometimes need to be reminded, and we need to be reassured that there are techniques that you can use that are efficient in calming and reassuring people. PFA is not a clinical or psychiatric intervention, although it can be part of good clinical care. It is not the same as a psychological debriefing. A psychological debriefing is a specific technique which is sometimes used but is not recommended for emergency situations. It is not asking someone to analyze what has happened to them or to put time and events in order. Especially children will mix up when what happened, and it is not that interesting for you in the acute phase to figure out the order of the different, or the sequence of the different events. And it is not pressuring people to tell you their story. It is not helpful in itself to tell your story in the acute phase. Your purpose is to get as much information as you need so you are able to assess the situation and refer if needed. PFA is not asking people in detail how they feel or what happened. You should be careful not to try to get all the details from people, especially from children. This may trigger responses that are more serious, and it is not helpful in the acute situation. When do we provide psychological first aid? We provide psychological first aid during an emergency situation or immediately after a crisis event. This can be an earthquake, it can be a bombing if we are talking about an armed conflict, and it can also be a car traffic accident, for example. We also provide psychological first aid as part of our capacity building in a disaster preparedness intervention in emergency-prone areas. It is an extremely useful skill set to have whenever going into the field. We also provide PFA during or after a crisis affecting a small group of children, so it is not necessary really an intervention which is only for large populations. It can be, for example, a fire in a school or another situation that affects a limited amount of people. We also provide PFA as an immediate intervention with children who have been sexually or physically abused or neglected. Psychological first aid is sometimes an excellent response for children who have disclosed sexual abuse and who are in acute crisis. In crisis events, children react and think differently to adults. This is why we have a specific training on psychological first aid for children, because depending on the age and stage of the child, children will have a different cognitive development. That means that children have different ways of thinking and processing information. Children probably have exactly the same feelings as adults, but they are processed and understood differently according how developed your memory and your information processing and your problem solving is developed. Children are vulnerable to adverse effects due to their physical size and social and emotional attachment to caregivers. Which children need psychological first aid? Not all children need psychological first aid. Like adults, some children cope very well with difficult experiences. And later we will explore how children react to stressful events and how to identify children who are in distress and may need psychological first aid. The action principles for psychological first aid for children is the same as they are for psychological first aid for adults. We talk about the look, listen, and link principles, and these are adapted from the WHO Psychological First Aid Field Guide for Field Workers that we talked about earlier. Most children will recover well if they are reunited with their parents or caregivers, if they have their basic needs met, if they feel safe and out of danger, and they receive support like psychological first aid for children, and at the right time, and given by a responsive and alert adult or young person. Children who may need extra help are children who remain very distressed and maintain a dramatic change in their personality and behavior and cannot function daily in their lives. Children who feel threatened in their daily life may need extra help also. And children who are at risk of doing harm to themselves or others are also in need of immediate extra help. If a child is severely distressed, avoid leaving him or her alone. Stay with the child until the reaction has passed or until you can get help from others. You will find in your handout number 1 a list of when to worry. These are behaviors and signs in children that you should respond to immediately and refer to more specialized staff. Session 3. For this session you will need handout number 2. Please, before you look at the handout, consider children at different ages that you know. You can consider an infant, a child who is 3 years old, a child who is 10 years old, and an adolescent. Think about how this child would react to a crisis and what you would do to help it. When you have reflected on your own experiences and children you know or that you have seen, have a look at the handout and read through all the most common reactions and how to support children. All these reactions are based on children's developmental ability to process information and the experiences that are the most common at these age groups. Session number 4. In this session we will explore identifying children who need PFA and the PFA action principles. For this session you will need the animated movie and your handout number 3 on advice to parents. So how do we identify children who need psychological first aid? The children who are at risk of strong reactions are children who are separated from their family or caregivers, children who have watched loved ones or others being hurt or killed, children who have been physically hurt, children who have felt threatened, and children who are worried and concerned because their parents or caregivers are grieving or concerned too. We are also very aware of children who feel guilty about surviving when others have died. This is especially typical for adolescents, as you saw in your previous session. Now, children with obvious signs of distress, those are the children who have physical symptoms of not feeling well, such as shaking, headaches, loss of appetite, aches and pains. Children who cry a lot, children who are agitated and panicking, and children who are aggressive and try to hurt others, kicking, biting, hitting, and so on. It is also children who cling continuously to their caregivers. There are more signs of obvious distress, such as seeming confused and disoriented, children who appear withdrawn or very quiet with little or no movements, and children who hide or shy away from other people, children who do not respond to others and who do not speak at all, and children who are very scared. Please remember your first handout that specified the reasons, the behaviors that should make you worry, and when you should refer to specialized services. Please take a minute now to consider which behaviors would be culturally specific in your contexts. Are there any ways that children show distress that are particular to your context? Now, please consider what are the obvious signs of distress in parents and caregivers. Think about parents and caregivers that you have met and that have shown signs of distress. Generally, many people who are distressed and who have children may be irritable, may be angry, or may be withdrawn. This affects their parenting. In your handout, Advice to Parents, you will see good advice that you will be able to give to parents so that they are better able to fulfill their parenting role with their children and support them in times of crisis. Now let's look at the PFA action principles. You remember that we talked about the look, listen and link principle. We will show you a 1-minute animated movie, and while watching it you should consider how the helper first looks and observes, sees signs of distress in children, then gets the information, listens carefully to children, reassures them and comforts them, and then links them to services. Have a look at the animated movie. Now you have seen a very short example of the action principles of PFA. For children, the listening skills and the observation skills are important because children do not react the same way as adults. Remember your handout with the different typical reactions from children at different ages. Session 5. How to communicate with children in distress. For this session, you will need the animated movie once again, and you will need your handout number 4. Please have a look at handout number 4. In there you will find a description of some basic techniques that you will use in psychological first aid for children. Remember that the action principles are look, listen, and link. To look, you should know the common signs of distress in children that we have been talking about previously. Listen is the communication that you have with children where you get the sufficient information, that you stabilize and comfort, so that you are prepared to do the linking to the relevant services. Remember that not all the techniques that you will find in your handout will be used every time. After you have initially identified the child, you will approach the child and make yourself known. Please remember to squat so that you're not standing too tall in front of the child, which can be intimidating, and be careful to have an open, kind, and welcoming body language. Perhaps you live in a culture where eye contact is not appropriate and may be intimidating. Please consider the cultural aspects of communication. Please read your handout number 4 carefully, and after doing so, have a look at the animated movie once again and look at it from the perspective of the different techniques that you have now seen in your handout. Session 6, wrap up. We have now talked about the action principles for psychological first aid, which are look, listen, and link. We have also talked about the specific needs of children, because children may have the same emotional experiences as adults, but they do not process information and they do not have the same level of experience as adults do. Also, children are very dependent on the way that adults are able to nurture and care and protect children. We have talked about different techniques that you can use after having made your initial contact with the child. Please make sure to be very well informed about the different communication techniques. You may not be using all of them at the same time, but you need to use the techniques that are relevant for you to communicate well, get the necessary information, and calm and reassure the situation. Also make sure that you are well aware of the referral services, both for mental health and for other basic health services. You may also need to have the information on protection services. All this material is derived from the 2-day psychological first aid from child practitioners training by Save the Children, which can be found on our website, and also the 1-day PFA training for child practitioners, which is a 1-day version of the 2-day training. The best of luck to you in the field.